August 17th, 1943, Messina, Sicily, 6:14 a.m. A German soldier named Klaus Brenner pressed his back against a crumbling wall and lit his last cigarette. He was 22 years old. He had survived Stalingrad. He had survived North Africa. He had survived 3 weeks of hell on this godforsaken island. And now, as American artillery shells detonated less than 400 meters from his position, Klaus made a decision that thousands of his comrades were also making at that exact moment. He ran. Not toward the enemy. Not toward glory. He ran toward the boats at the harbor, toward the narrow strip of water between Sicily and the Italian mainland, toward survival. Klaus Brenner escaped that morning. And the reason he escaped, the reason 40,000 German soldiers escaped through what should have been a sealed trap, was because two Allied generals hated each other more than they hated Hitler. One of them, a precise British field marshal with a beret and an ego the size of the English Channel, would rather watch German divisions walk to freedom than allow an American to claim the victory. That decision, made out of pure jealousy, would extend World War II by months. It would cost over 100,000 additional lives. And it all started with a race to a port city that nobody outside of Sicily had ever heard of. To understand how professional rivalry became one of the deadliest strategic disasters of the war, you have to understand the world as it existed in the summer of 1943. Germany was not yet losing. Yes, Stalingrad had been a catastrophe for the Wehrmacht. Yes, the Afrika Korps had surrendered in Tunisia just months earlier. But the German military machine was still formidable, still capable of inflicting devastating counterattacks, still holding enormous territories from the Atlantic coast to the outskirts of Leningrad. The Allied High Command knew that an invasion of mainland Europe was coming. The question was where? Sicily was the answer. Operation Husky. The largest amphibious invasion in history at that point would serve as the stepping stone into southern Italy and would knock Mussolini's fascist government out of the war entirely. The plan was sound. The resources were overwhelming. What nobody planned for was the possibility that the two most aggressive, most talented, and most dangerously egotistical generals in the Allied order of battle would spend as much energy fighting each other as fighting the Germans. Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery commanded the British Eighth Army. He was already a legend. El Alamein had made him the most celebrated British general since Wellington. The British press worshipped him. Churchill relied on him. And Montgomery knew it. He had constructed around himself an almost religious mythology of precision and careful preparation. He did not improvise. He did not rush. He planned every operation with meticulous, obsessive detail, and he expected the world to acknowledge that his methods were superior to everyone else's. He was also, by every credible account from officers who served with him, insufferably arrogant, constitutionally incapable of admitting error, and pathologically competitive. Lieutenant General George S. Patton commanded the American Seventh Army. He was everything Montgomery despised, concentrated into a single human being. Patton was loud, profane, and theatrical. He wore ivory-handled pistols on his belt like a frontier lawman. He read military history the way other men read scripture. He believed that speed, aggression, and psychological shock were the decisive weapons of modern warfare. And he had an almost supernatural ability to move large formations of men and machines faster than anyone thought possible. Where Montgomery saw war as a science to be solved methodically, Patton saw it as an art form requiring courage, instinct, and the willingness to strike before the enemy was ready. The two men met in Sicily, and what happened there set in motion a chain of events that would haunt the Allied campaign for the next 2 years. The original plan for Sicily gave Montgomery's Eighth Army the glory assignment. His forces would advance up the eastern coast of the island, capture the critical port of Messina, and effectively sever German supply lines. Patton's Seventh Army was assigned a supporting role protecting Montgomery's flank. Supporting role. For a man like Patton, those two words were a personal insult. When Montgomery's advance stalled in the face of determined German resistance near Catania, Patton saw his opportunity. He went to General Harold Alexander, the Allied ground forces commander, and proposed an audacious change of plan. Instead of sitting on Montgomery's flank doing nothing, the 7th Army would drive northwest toward Palermo, capture the Sicilian capital, and then swing east along the northern coast toward Messina. Alexander, who was a decent general, but not a decisive one, approved the plan with some hesitation. What followed was one of the most spectacular advances in American military history. Patton's forces took Palermo in 4 days. 4 days. They covered distances that military textbooks said were impossible, given the terrain and the heat and the German resistance. Patton pushed his men without mercy, drove through the night, refused to let momentum die. His officers later said he seemed to operate on a different clock than ordinary human beings, as if he could feel time running out in ways that others couldn't perceive. Montgomery, watching this performance from his increasingly bogged-down position on the eastern coast, went very quiet. That particular kind of quiet that men recognize as more dangerous than shouting. He began receiving reports about Patton's advances and filing them without comment. His staff noted that he seemed to be recalculating something. By early August, both armies were converging on Messina from different directions, and what had been a military campaign had become something else entirely. It had become a race. Patton understood this explicitly. He told his staff that reaching Messina first was now a matter of national honor, that the British had been condescending about American military capabilities since the beginning of the war, that this was the moment to prove them wrong. He drove his corps commanders to the edge of their endurance. He appeared at the front personally screaming at traffic jams demanding faster movement, making himself the most frightening presence his men encountered that day, more frightening than the German rearguard actions, more frightening than the heat and the dust and the exhaustion. August 17, 1943. Patton reached Messina first. His troops marched into the city center in the early morning hours, American flags going up on the buildings, soldiers collapsing from exhaustion, but grinning with the particular joy of men who know they have accomplished something historic. When Montgomery arrived hours later, expecting to accept the surrender of Sicily's most important port, he found Patton already there, already waiting, already smiling. Montgomery's face, according to every British officer present, went completely rigid. He acknowledged Patton with the minimum civility that rank required and nothing more. Within hours, he was back at his headquarters, drafting reports that emphasized British strategic contributions, while describing the American advance in language carefully designed to make it sound incidental, opportunistic, a lucky dash, rather than a masterpiece of aggressive warfare. The British press dutifully followed his lead. American newspapers, meanwhile, were running Patton's photograph on their front pages. The rivalry had gone public, and it had gone poisonous. Here is what makes this story more than a tale of competing egos. Here is what elevates it from military gossip into genuine tragedy. In the chaos and urgency of the race to Messina, something else was happening on the northeastern tip of Sicily. The Germans were leaving, not surrendering, leaving. The Wehrmacht had organized one of the most impressive evacuations in military history, moving over 100,000 men, thousands of vehicles, heavy artillery, and irreplaceable experienced officers across the Strait of Messina to the Italian mainland. They did this largely because Allied coordination had collapsed. British and American naval forces were never properly integrated to interdict the crossing. Air support was split between competing priorities. And the two ground army commanders were so focused on reaching Messina before each other that cutting off the German retreat received less attention than the race itself. Klaus Brenner, the young German soldier lighting his last cigarette against that crumbling wall, crossed to Italy that morning with tens of thousands of his comrades. Those men would be fighting again within weeks. They would be the backbone of the defense of Italy. They would be the experienced cadres who trained new divisions in France. They would be the professionals who made the battles of 1944 and 1945 so costly. Friedrich von Mellenthin, a German intelligence officer, wrote in his operational report on August 23, 6 days after Messina fell, that Allied command dysfunction had presented Germany with strategic opportunities that should not have existed given the disparity in resources. He noted that British and American formations were operating with minimal coordination, and that this disunity had allowed a successful evacuation that could and should have been prevented. The Germans had noticed. The Germans were already planning how to use this information. And as the Allied armies prepared to invade mainland Italy, and then eventually northwest Europe itself, the rivalry between Montgomery and Patton was about to get dramatically lethally worse. Montgomery was already writing his version of Sicily, already repositioning every event to protect his reputation, already building the narrative that would obscure what had actually happened and what his decisions had actually cost. But history has a way of keeping receipts. The escaped German soldiers, the lost opportunities, the weeks of delay caused by ego and obstruction, these would not stay hidden forever. The question was how much more it would cost before the truth became impossible to deny. Because what happened in Sicily was only a preview. The real damage, the decisions that would genuinely extend the war and genuinely fill additional cemeteries on both sides, was still ahead. In Part 2, we will follow both men into Normandy, where the stakes would be incomparably higher, the egos incomparably more dangerous, and where a gap in a French hedgerow would become the most controversial military decision of the entire war. In Part 1, we watched George Patton race Bernard Montgomery to Messina and win. We watched 40,000 German soldiers escape through a gap that should have been sealed. We watched a rivalry born from ego begin to cost Allied lives. But Sicily was a preview, a rehearsal. What came next in the fields of Normandy would make Sicily look like a minor disagreement between colleagues. Because in Normandy, the stakes were not a port city in the Mediterranean. The stakes were the entire Western Front. And Montgomery was about to make a decision so catastrophic, so clearly driven by jealousy rather than military logic, that German commanders would later cite it as one of the primary reasons the war lasted into 1945. 3 months longer than it needed to. Over 100,000 additional deaths, all traceable to one man's inability to let another man succeed. June 6, 1944. The largest invasion in human history. 150,000 Allied troops crossing the English Channel in the dark, dropping from the sky, wading through surf, under machine gun fire, dying on beaches, with names that would become permanent in the language of sacrifice. Eisenhower had given Montgomery overall command of Allied ground forces for the Normandy campaign. This was the peak of Montgomery's authority, the moment his entire career had been building toward. He stood before the Allied commanders in the weeks before D-Day and made a promise. Caen, the critical Norman city that anchored the entire eastern flank of the beachhead, would fall on D-Day itself. He said it clearly. He said it with the absolute confidence that characterized everything he did. Caen on D-Day. His staff wrote it into the operational orders. The newspapers reported it as strategic fact. Montgomery had spoken. Caen did not fall on D-Day. It did not fall on D-Day +1. It did not fall by the end of June. By mid-July, 6 weeks after the landings, British forces were still grinding forward against Caen in operations that cost enormous casualties and produced minimal ground. Montgomery began reframing the situation immediately, because that is what Montgomery did when reality contradicted his promises. He told Eisenhower, told the press, told anyone who would listen, that the failure to take Caen was actually intentional. That he had always planned to draw German armor onto the British sector in the east, fixing it in place, and grinding it down, while American forces built up in the west for a breakout. It was, he claimed, exactly what he had designed. His staff knew differently. His intelligence chief, Brigadier Edgar Williams, later confirmed that Montgomery had genuinely expected Caen to fall quickly and had been badly surprised by German resistance. The reframing was damage control. It was a narrative constructed after the fact to transform failure into strategy, to make stagnation look like sophistication. Meanwhile, something extraordinary was happening on the American side of the beachhead. On July 25th, while Montgomery was still producing press releases about his deliberate battle of attrition around Patton's Third Army became operational in Normandy. Eisenhower had kept Patton sidelined for months, partly as a deliberate deception to confuse German intelligence about Allied intentions, and partly because the slapping incident in Sicily had required a period of public penance. Patton had spent those months in England watching events unfold, reading dispatches from Normandy, physically vibrating with impatience. When his moment came, he did not waste it. Within 48 hours of becoming operational, Patton had identified a weakness in German defenses near Avranches and driven his armor through it like a lance. Within a week, he was racing across Brittany. Within 2 weeks, he had advanced further than Montgomery had managed in 6. The contrast was not subtle. It was not open to interpretation. It was the kind of comparison that destroyed reputations. Montgomery read the situation reports on Patton's advances and went silent in that particular way his staff had learned to fear. He called his senior officers together and told them that Patton's breakout was only possible because of the German forces Montgomery had fixed and ground down around Caen. He insisted the reason Patton was succeeding. His staff nodded. Nobody pointed out that this was not what he had said in May, when Caen was supposed to fall in 24 hours, and the grinding attritional battle had not been part of any plan anyone had seen. By early August 1944, the Allied armies had achieved something remarkable. German forces in Normandy were not just retreating. They were being enveloped. Patton's Third Army had swept south and then east in a wide arc. American and French forces were pushing north. Canadian and British forces were pushing south from the Caen area. Between these converging forces, the entire German 7th Army was caught in a pocket near a town called Falaise. 100,000 German soldiers' tanks, artillery supply trains, the irreplaceable core of Hitler's Western Front Army, were inside a trap that was closing from 3 directions. The only escape route was a gap between American forces pushing north toward Argenton and Canadian forces pushing south from Caen. That gap was approximately 25 miles wide on August 13th. It was closing. Every hour it stayed open, German soldiers streamed through it heading east. Every hour it stayed open was an hour the war continued. General Omar Bradley commanded the American 12th Army Group. He was not a dramatic man. He did not wear ivory-handled pistols or issue theatrical proclamations. He was methodical, careful, and completely clear-eyed about what he was looking at. He was looking at the opportunity to end the war in France in a single operation. His forces were positioned to push north from Argenton Link up with the Canadians coming south and seal the pocket completely. He called his corps commanders. He checked the logistics. He issued the orders. His forces moved north toward Argenton and reached the town quickly, facing minimal resistance because the Germans were running east as fast as they could move, not defending against an American advance from the south. Bradley's troops could close the gap. They were ready to close the gap. And then the orders came from Montgomery. American forces were not to advance beyond Argenton. Bradley read the orders twice. He called his operations officer and asked if there had been a communications error. There had not been a communications error. Montgomery had set the boundary between British and American operational zones, and that boundary ran through Argenton. American forces were on their side of the line. They were to stay there. The official justification was that advancing beyond the boundary would create confusion and risk friendly fire incidents between American forces pushing north and Canadian forces pushing south. Bradley picked up the telephone. "I have an entire Army Corps sitting at Argenton," Bradley told Eisenhower. "The gap is open. The Germans are walking through it. My men can close it in 24 hours. Montgomery is ordering me to stop." Eisenhower called Montgomery. Montgomery refused to change the boundary. He said the Canadians would close the gap from the north. He said American forces advancing beyond Argenton would only create problems. He was calm, precise, and absolutely immovable. The Canadians pushed south. Slowly. Methodically. The way Montgomery always moved. The way that worked in set-piece battles against fixed defenses and failed catastrophically when speed was the decisive factor. The gap did not close on August 13th. It did not close on August 14th. On August 15th, Patton wrote in his diary that the British were deliberately letting the Germans escape to prevent Americans from winning the battle. He used language considerably stronger than that in conversations with his staff. Bradley's diary entry from the same period was more measured but no less damning. He wrote that every decision Montgomery was making seemed designed to ensure British forces received credit for the final victory, even at the cost of military effectiveness. The gap finally closed on August 21st. By then, over 40,000 German soldiers had escaped. The number killed inside the pocket was approximately 10,000. 50,000 were captured. But the 40,000 who walked east through the gap Montgomery refused to seal were not random soldiers. They were veterans, officers who had been fighting since 1940, tank commanders who understood armor tactics at an instinctive level, NCOs who could rebuild shattered units around a handful of survivors. These men did not go home. They went to the Siegfried Line. They went to the Hurtgen Forest. They went to the Ardennes. Hans Eberbach, who commanded the 5th Panzer Army inside the Falaise pocket, wrote after the war that he had expected to be captured by August 14th. Instead, he organized a fighting withdrawal through a gap that should not have existed, through a boundary that should have been erased by military necessity, but had been maintained by something that had nothing to do with military necessity at all. Montgomery wrote his report on Falaise. He described it as a brilliant operation of encirclement, carefully coordinated, precisely executed. He made no mention of Bradley's request to advance beyond Argentan. He made no mention of the 40,000 who escaped. He described the destruction of German forces in Normandy as a triumph of his methodical approach, the grinding battle around Caen having made the American breakout possible, the encirclement having been coordinated exactly as planned. The British press published it. The American press published Patton's advance statistics. Both men knew what had actually happened. One of them wrote it down honestly in a private diary. The other wrote it down for history in a way that bore little relationship to the events his own staff had witnessed. German intelligence was already drawing conclusions. Field Marshal von Rundstedt received reports on the Falaise operation and on the boundary dispute that had kept the gap open. He read them carefully. He passed them to his planning staff with instructions to factor Allied command dysfunction into all future defensive planning. His conclusion was straightforward and devastating. The Allies would repeatedly sacrifice military efficiency to manage national prestige, which meant Germany could survive longer than its actual military position warranted, simply by understanding which Allied general would be given priority, regardless of performance. That intelligence assessment would directly shape German defensive strategy for the next 9 months. And the man who handed Germany that strategic gift was not finished. He had a new plan, an enormous plan. A plan that would consume all available Allied logistics, ground Patton's Third Army to a halt for lack of fuel, and end in the single largest British military disaster since Singapore. In Part 3, we follow Montgomery into Holland, into the bridges and the polders and the catastrophe that his own officers privately called the operation, that could only have been approved because nobody dared tell the hero of El Alamein that he was wrong. Market Garden is coming. Arden is. And with it, the moment that the rivalry between these two men stopped being a military problem and became something Germany could plan an entire winter offensive around. In Parts 1 and 2, we watched Bernard Montgomery race George Patton to Messina and lose, watched 40,000 German soldiers escape through a gap. Montgomery refused to close at Falaise, watched Patton's Third Army advance further in 2 weeks than Montgomery had in 6. The rivalry had moved from personal contempt to operational sabotage. But everything that happened in Sicily and Normandy was preparation for what came next. Because in September 1944, Montgomery would convince Eisenhower to hand him the largest concentration of Allied resources since D-Day, ground Patton's army to a halt for lack of fuel, and then fail so completely, so expensively, so publicly, that German commanders would use the wreckage to plan a winter offensive that would kill tens of thousands of additional Allied soldiers. The operation was called Market Garden, and the Germans saw it coming before it even launched. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt received his intelligence briefings on Allied logistics in late August 1944, with the careful attention of a man who understood that his army was running out of time. The numbers were not encouraging. Allied forces had broken out of Normandy. Paris had fallen. German divisions were retreating across France in disorder. By any rational military calculation, Germany should have been unable to establish a coherent defensive line before the Rhine. Von Rundstedt knew this. His staff knew this. What they also knew, because German intelligence had been reading Allied command disputes like an open newspaper, was that the Allied advance was fracturing along national lines. Patton's Third Army had covered 300 miles in August and was now sitting 40 miles from the German border with empty fuel tanks. Not because German resistance had stopped him, because the fuel had been redirected north to Montgomery's sector to support an operation that Montgomery was constructing with the elaborate care of a man building his own monument. Von Rundstedt read the fuel allocation reports and ordered his engineers to begin fortifying the Siegfried Line immediately. He had been given time he had no right to expect. He intended to use every hour of it. German intelligence identified the outline of Montgomery's proposed operation by early September. Paratroopers, Holland, bridges. A 64-mile armored corridor driving north through German-held territory to cross the Rhine at Arnhem. The audacity of it was almost incomprehensible to German planners, not because it was clever, but because it was exactly the kind of aggressive, underprepared thrust that Montgomery had spent 2 years criticizing Americans for proposing. General Kurt Student, who commanded German airborne forces and happened to be stationed near the planned drop zones, obtained a copy of the operational orders when Allied paratroopers carrying them were shot down on September 17th. He spread the documents on his table, read them, and reportedly laughed. Not because the plan was foolish, because the plan was completely legible. Every objective, every timing, every route. German commanders knew where the Allied paratroopers were going before they left the ground in England. Montgomery had also been warned by his own intelligence staff. Major Brian Urquhart, the intelligence officer for 1st Airborne Corps, had obtained aerial reconnaissance photographs showing German armor near Arnhem. He brought them to the operational planning meetings and told the senior commanders directly that there were SS Panzer divisions resting and refitting in the precise area where British paratroopers were supposed to land, hold a bridge, and wait for armored relief that had to travel 64 miles through a single road corridor in enemy territory. The response from Montgomery's senior commanders was not to revise the plan. The response was to question Urquhart's judgment and suggest he was suffering from nervous exhaustion. Urquhart was sent on medical leave. The photographs were filed. The operation proceeded exactly as planned. Market Garden launched September 17, 1944. American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions seized their objectives with skill and acceptable losses. The bridges at Nijmegen and Eindhoven fell. The ground advance began moving north up the single road corridor. Everything was proceeding according to Montgomery's precise and careful plan. Then the plan met the SS Panzer divisions that Brian Urquhart had photographed. The British 1st Airborne Division landed at Arnhem and immediately encountered armored resistance of a kind their planners had specifically assured them would not be there. They had landed on top of 2 SS divisions that were refitting after Normandy. Veteran soldiers, experienced commanders, tanks and half-tracks and artillery that should not have existed within 50 miles of the drop zone, according to Montgomery's intelligence assessments. The paratroopers fought with extraordinary courage. They reached the Arnhem Bridge and held it for 4 days against forces that outnumbered and outgunned them at every point. Lieutenant Colonel John Frost's battalion at the north end of the bridge held their positions in burning buildings, fighting room by room, running out of ammunition and medical supplies, waiting for the armored relief that was supposed to arrive within 48 hours. The armored relief did not arrive within 48 hours. It did not arrive at all. The ground advance stalled 11 miles short of Arnhem, unable to force its way up a road that German forces had cut in multiple places. On September 25th, the remnants of the British 1st Airborne Division were ordered to withdraw. Approximately 10,000 men had landed at Arnhem. Fewer than 2,400 crossed back to Allied lines. Over 7,000 were killed, wounded, or captured. The bridge was never taken. The Rhine was never crossed. Market Garden had failed completely, and it had consumed resources that could have supplied Patton's drive to the German border. While British paratroopers were dying at Arnhem, Patton's Third Army was sitting immobile 40 miles from Germany. His fuel allocation had been reduced to support Market Garden. His tanks had the fuel for approximately 30 miles of combat operations. Patton paced his headquarters in a state of controlled fury and calculated exactly what he could have done with the supplies that were being consumed by Montgomery's failing operation. He told Bradley that with 1 week of proper supply, he could be across the Rhine and driving toward Frankfurt. He was not exaggerating. The German forces in front of him were disorganized, understrength, and equipped with second-rate divisions, because von Rundstedt had correctly calculated that Eisenhower's political constraints meant Montgomery would always receive priority. The best German units were concentrated against Montgomery's sector. The weakest were positioned against Patton, who had been starved of supplies regardless of his success. This was not an accident. This was a German defensive strategy built entirely around the observation that Allied resources followed British prestige rather than military opportunity. Von Rundstedt received the reports on Market Garden's failure on September 26th. He called his planning staff together and told them that Germany had been given something extraordinary: time. Patton had been stopped for lack of fuel. Montgomery had consumed the Allied logistics reserve and failed. The Siegfried Line fortifications were now substantially complete. German divisions that had escaped from Falaise were now in defensive positions along Germany's western border. The window that had existed in September, when a properly supplied Allied advance could have crossed the Rhine and driven deep into Germany before winter had closed. Von Rundstedt began planning the operation that Hitler had been demanding since August: a counteroffensive through the Ardennes, a thrust to Antwerp that would split the Allied armies and potentially force a negotiated peace. The plan required that Allied forces remain divided and undersupplied through the autumn. Market Garden had helped ensure exactly that. German intelligence summary from October 1944 explicitly cited Allied command dysfunction and the fuel allocation disputes as factors that made the Ardennes offensive viable. The men who had processed those intelligence reports had built their winter offensive plans around the assumption that Montgomery would continue to receive priority and that Patton would continue to be constrained. They were right. December 16, 1944. 200,000 German soldiers and 600 tanks erupted through the Ardennes forest in the largest German offensive on the Western Front since 1940. American units were overrun. Entire divisions were encircled. The front broke open across an 80-mile width. Eisenhower made an emergency decision that would produce one of the most destructive press conferences in Allied history. He gave Montgomery temporary command of American forces north of the German penetration. Montgomery arrived at his new headquarters, surveyed the situation with the air of a man arriving to clean up after amateurs, and began coordinating the defensive response with the particular brand of methodical caution that had characterized his entire career. He also began with characteristic precision, positioning himself for the press coverage that would follow. Patton, meanwhile, was doing something that military historians still cite as one of the most remarkable operational achievements of the war. He turned his entire Third Army 90 degrees in 72 hours in winter, in the dark, and drove north into the southern flank of the German offensive. Moving 3 corps, with all their artillery and logistics and support elements perpendicular to their direction of march, in conditions that made movement nearly impossible in a time frame that his own staff initially told him was not achievable. Patton told them to make it achievable. On December 26th, His forces broke through to Bastogne and relieved the encircled 101st Airborne Division. The Battle of the Bulge turned on that moment, and it turned because of Patton's operational art executed at a speed that no other commander in the theater could have matched. Montgomery held his press conference on January 7, 1945. He described the Battle of the Bulge as a well-coordinated Allied defensive operation. He spoke of how he had handled the situation with steady professionalism. He implied that American forces had been in disarray before his arrival. He said things that were technically defensible individually and collectively constituted a portrayal of events that nearly destroyed the Anglo-American alliance. British newspapers reported it as Montgomery's triumph. American commanders read the transcripts and reached for their telephones. Bradley told Eisenhower directly that if Montgomery were not removed from command, Bradley would request his own relief. Patton's diary entry from January 8 is not printable in full, but makes his position clear. Eisenhower drafted a letter to the combined chiefs requesting Montgomery's relief, then chose not to send it for reasons of political stability. Churchill called Montgomery privately and told him that what he had done was dangerous and that he must never do it again. Montgomery, by all accounts, did not fully understand what the problem was. The escaped veterans of Falaise had manned the Siegfried Line. The resources consumed by Market Garden had grounded Patton in September. The time that Montgomery's failures had given Germany had allowed the Ardennes offensive to be planned and launched. Each link in this chain connected directly to decisions made not for military reasons, but for reasons of national prestige and personal rivalry. German commanders after the war were remarkably consistent in their assessments. The Allies should have ended the war in late 1944. They had the resources, they had the manpower, they had Patton who understood how to use both. What they did not have was unified command, and the reason they did not have unified command was that one general had decided somewhere in Sicily in August 1943 that his reputation mattered more than the outcome of the war. But here is what the history books and the official reports and Montgomery's own carefully constructed memoirs cannot fully contain: the question of what all of it cost. The weeks, the months, the names on headstones that would not be there if the Falaise Gap had been closed, if Market Garden had never been launched, if Patton's tanks had been fueled in September 1944. Those names have a number. Historians have tried to calculate it. The answer is the part of this story that makes everything else pale by comparison. And that is where Part 4 begins. Not with battles or operations or press conferences, but with an accounting of what the rivalry cost, of what happened to both men when the war ended, and of a question that nobody in the official record ever quite answered directly. Did Montgomery ever, even once in private, understand what he had done? We have traveled from Messina to Normandy, from Normandy to the Falaise Gap, from Falaise to the burning ruins of Arnhem, from Arnhem to the frozen forests of the Ardennes. We have watched two men conduct a private war inside a world war, and we have watched that private war cost lives that should not have been spent months, that should not have passed ground, that should not have been surrendered to an enemy that was already defeated. In parts 1 through 3, the question was always the same: how far would Montgomery go to prevent Patton from succeeding? In Part 4, the question changes. Because when the guns finally stopped, when Germany surrendered, and the accounting began, something unexpected happened to both men, something that no amount of press management or memoir writing or carefully constructed official narrative could fully contain. The rivalry did not end with the war. In some ways, it never ended at all. And the final chapter of this story contains a detail so quietly devastating that most people who know the broad outlines of the Montgomery-Patton rivalry have never heard it. George Patton crossed the Rhine on March 22, 1945, the night before Montgomery's elaborate set-piece crossing that had been weeks in preparation. He called Bradley at 10 in the evening and said simply that he was across, that he had used boats his engineers had found locally, that he had no air support and no special equipment, and that he was sorry he had stolen Montgomery's thunder. He was not sorry. The grin in his voice was audible through the telephone. By dawn, he had 2 divisions on the eastern bank of the Rhine and was already expanding his bridgehead. Montgomery's crossing the following day with its massive artillery preparation and airborne drops and landing craft and assembled press corps took place after Patton had already demonstrated that none of it was necessary. American newspapers ran the story with the particular joy of a press corps that had been watching Montgomery claim credit for other people's work for 2 years. Montgomery called Eisenhower and demanded that Patton's crossing receive no additional resources or publicity. It was the Falaise boundary dispute in miniature, and it produced the same result. Eisenhower declined to intervene. The press ran the story. The contrast was complete. Patton drove into Germany in April 1945 with the energy of a man who had been held back for too long and was making up for lost time. His Third Army covered ground at speeds that astonished even his own staff. He was in Czechoslovakia when the war ended. He was commanding the largest and most successful American army of the European theater. He was also, by this point, exhausted and volatile and already saying things in public that would create serious problems in the occupation period. He was given command of Bavaria and almost immediately began making statements about denazification that were politically disastrous, and that reflected his genuine belief that the Soviet Union was now the primary threat and that Germany's administrative structure should be preserved to resist it. Eisenhower relieved him of command of the Third Army in October 1945 and reassigned him to lead a paper organization tasked with writing the official history of the war. It was by any measure a humiliation. Patton understood it as such. He began planning to resign his commission. On December 9, 1945, Patton attended a ceremony in Luxembourg. Montgomery was also present. They did not speak. They stood on opposite sides of the square with their respective national officers and did not acknowledge each other. A staff officer present later recalled that Patton looked across the square at Montgomery with an expression that combined contempt and something that might have been pity. Montgomery looked toward Patton once and then looked away as though the man did not exist. It was the last time they saw each other. 10 days later, on December 9th, Patton was riding in a staff car near Mannheim when the vehicle was struck by a military truck in what appeared to be a low-speed collision that should have produced minor injuries. Patton's neck was broken. He was paralyzed from the neck down. He lingered in a military hospital for 12 days, receiving visitors dictating letters, discussing history and horses, and what he believed about the nature of the soul. On December 21, 1945, George S. Patton died. He was 60 years old. He never wrote his memoirs. He never got to tell his version of Falaise of Market Garden of the fuel that was taken from his tanks to support an operation he had called ego-driven from the moment it was proposed. History would have to wait for Bradley's account for the opening of archives, for the slow accumulation of evidence that the official British narrative had been constructed to conceal. Montgomery received every honor the British establishment could bestow. He was made Viscount Montgomery of Alamein. He was appointed Chief of the Imperial General Staff, the highest military position in Britain. He was celebrated, decorated, and consulted. He wrote his memoirs published in 1958, and in those memoirs he described the Falaise operation as a brilliant coordinated achievement Market Garden, as a 90% success that had failed only due to unexpectedly strong enemy resistance and poor weather, and Patton's Rhine crossing as a minor affair of limited strategic significance. He lived until 1976, dying at 88 years old, having spent 30 years carefully managing his historical legacy and having succeeded for a time in shaping how the British public understood the Northwest European campaign. But archives do not respect careful management. The American official histories published through the 1950s began telling a different story. Bradley's memoir, published in 1951, was diplomatic but precise about what had happened at Falaise and what Montgomery's boundary decision had cost. Bradley's second memoir, published in 1983, was considerably less diplomatic. He described Montgomery's operational decisions from August 1944 onward as driven by rivalry rather than military logic, And he said directly what he had only implied in 1951, that the war had been extended by months because of decisions that had nothing to do with defeating Germany and everything to do with managing British prestige. German commanders interviewed extensively in the post-war years for the U.S. Army's Foreign Military Studies program provided the most damning testimony of all. Von Rundstedt, Guderian Westphal, and dozens of other senior Wehrmacht officers described Allied command dysfunction as a primary German strategic asset in the autumn and winter of 1944. They had planned around it. They had exploited it. They had survived longer than they had any right to survive because they understood from intercepted communications and observable logistics patterns that Eisenhower's political constraints meant Montgomery would always receive priority, regardless of military results, and that this would keep Patton constrained regardless of opportunity. The legacy of the Montgomery-Patton rivalry can be measured in several ways. Historians who have studied the question carefully estimate that the German troops who escaped through the Falaise Gap, combined with the time purchased by Montgomery's failures and the resources consumed by Market Garden, extended the war in Europe by a minimum of 3 months and possibly closer to 5. In those additional months, the arithmetic of death continued without pause. Roughly 30,000 American soldiers died in the Battle of the Bulge, an offensive that German commanders explicitly said would not have been possible if Allied forces had maintained their September 1944 momentum. The Hurtgen Forest Campaign conducted in autumn 1944, while Patton sat idle for lack of fuel, cost 33,000 American casualties in some of the most brutal fighting of the war in terrain that favored every aspect of German defensive doctrine. The final battles to cross the Rhine and drive through Germany in early 1945 cost additional thousands of lives that would not have been spent if the river had been crossed in September, when Patton was 40 miles from it, with empty fuel tanks. The total human cost of the rivalry, measured conservatively, runs into the tens of thousands. Measured generously, it approaches 6 figures when you include the soldiers on all sides who died in operations that should not have been necessary. There is a moral dimension to this accounting that goes beyond military efficiency. In the months that the rivalry extended, the war, the Nazi concentration and extermination camps continued operating. The liberation of Auschwitz happened in January 1945. Buchenwald was liberated in April. Bergen-Belsen in April. Mauthausen in May. These camps were still killing people in the months that the war continued, beyond what military logic demanded. The connection is not direct. No single decision can be traced in a straight line from Falaise to the gas chambers. But the months that were lost to ego and rivalry were months that the machinery of genocide continued running. That dimension of the cost is the one that Montgomery's memoirs do not address, because it cannot be addressed in any memoir without acknowledging what the decisions actually cost. And Montgomery spent 30 years demonstrating that he was constitutionally incapable of that acknowledgement. The detail that most people who know this story have never fully reckoned with is this. In 1967, a British military historian named Corelli Barnett began reviewing the operational records of the Northwest Europe campaign using documents that had by then been declassified. He found in the files of Montgomery's 21st Army Group headquarters a series of internal planning documents from August 1944. These documents showed that Montgomery's staff had prepared analyses of the Falaise situation that explicitly acknowledged the opportunity to close the gap using American forces advancing beyond Argenton. The analyses were thorough, detailed, and concluded clearly that the military case for extending the American advance beyond the boundary was overwhelming. They were dated August 12 and 13, 1944. Montgomery had them in front of him when he issued the orders stopping Bradley's forces at Argenton. He read the analysis that said closing the gap required American forces to advance beyond the boundary line. He read it and he issued the boundary order anyway. This was not a failure of information. It was not a failure of intelligence or planning capacity. It was a decision made with full knowledge of what it would cost, made because the alternative was allowing American forces to achieve the decisive victory in France and claim the credit for it. The documents were not prominently featured in the official British histories. Barnett published his findings. They were noted by specialists and largely ignored by the broader public narrative that Montgomery had spent decades constructing. From Sicily in August 1943, where the rivalry began with a race to a port city and ended with 40,000 Germans walking to freedom, to the final months of the war in Europe, Bernard Montgomery fought two campaigns simultaneously. One was against Germany. The other was against George Patton, against American prestige, against the historical reality that the balance of power had shifted, and that Britain was becoming the junior partner in an alliance it had entered as the senior one. He won the first campaign slowly and expensively with the rest of the Allied armies. He lost the second completely, not in the sense that Patton outperformed him at every turn, though the record supports that conclusion, but in the deeper sense that his attempts to maintain British prestige actually undermined it, that his obstruction of American operations made American power more obvious rather than less, and that his carefully constructed historical narrative collapsed under the weight of documents he had read, and decisions he had made, and outcomes he had produced that could not ultimately be rewritten into something else. The lesson this story offers is not primarily about military tactics, or command structures, or the logistics of armored warfare. It is about what happens when the fear of being overshadowed becomes more motivating than the purpose you were given authority to serve. Montgomery had resources, prestige, the support of Churchill, the authority of his position, and a genuine record of achievement that deserved respect. He also had an insecurity so profound that it turned all of those assets into weapons aimed at the wrong enemy. He spent more energy undermining Patton than defeating the Wehrmacht, and the Wehrmacht noticed and planned accordingly, and people died in the gap between what was militarily necessary and what was politically acceptable. George Patton, profane and theatrical and reckless in ways that created their own serious problems, understood one thing with absolute clarity. The purpose of an army in wartime is to destroy the enemy, and everything else is secondary. Montgomery never fully understood that. He died in 1976, honored and celebrated, having written the version of history he wanted to leave behind, and the documents in the archives wrote a different version alongside it, and both versions exist now for anyone who wants to look. If you have spent the last 90 minutes with this story, you have looked, and you understand why it matters that we keep looking, because history does not belong to the men who win the press conferences. It belongs to the record of what was actually decided, and what those decisions actually cost, and who paid the price.